Okay, so in today's lecture, we're going to be discussing how the art of the late Middle Ages and the art of the early Renaissance transitions to a period that we call the High Renaissance, or the height of the Renaissance. When last we checked in on our friends down in Florence, we talked about the transition from the late Middle Ages, the late medieval period, to the art of Cimabue and Giotto. And we looked at this painting, Giotto's Christ Entering Jerusalem, which he did about the same year that Petrarch was born. So we looked a little at the linear perspective and Giotto's new techniques and how we're starting to get paintings that have the illusion of having three dimensions, even though they're two-dimensional. Well, if we fast forward about 100 years, painters are going to continue to expand on that technique, and they're going to use those different artistic techniques that we discussed, like Smafuto and chiaroscuro, to give us paintings that have greater illusion of depth and greater realism. So by the time we get to the early 15th century, the first half of the 15th century, we get sculpture that looks like this. So here we are in Padua, and I showed you this sculpture already. This is Donatello's sculpture of the Condottieri, the great warlord Gattamelata, the honey cat. And this sculpture is important because it represents, or it did for Vasari anyway, the Renaissance artist finally achieving a degree of accuracy in sculpture that is equal to what the ancients were able to achieve themselves. So we finally reached a point by the middle of the 15th century that we're as good as the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans. There is a level of realism here that we would see from classical civilization. But I will argue that in the next 100 years, the sculptures or the people engaging in sculpture during the High Renaissance will achieve a level of greatness that exceeds the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. So we've matched them here, and in the High Renaissance, we're going to exceed them. Here is Donatello's David. This is, I believe, this is subjective, but for me, this is his most important and his most famous work. It was commissioned by Florence. Donatello does some interesting things here. We can tell that it's David, obviously. I mean, here you have a young boy with a sword. He's standing confidently with his foot in that contrapposto pose, with his foot on the head of this giant. He's just cut off the head of Goliath. And David becomes the mascot for Florence. So if you think about Florence, Florence is this city surrounded by greater nations, by greater communities. To the north of Florence, you have France, which is rapidly becoming the most important continental power. To the east of France, you have the Holy Roman Empire. To the south of Florence, you have Rome, and Rome, accepting the Avignon papacy, is the headquarters of this global religious institution, the Roman Catholic Church. To the east of Florence, you have Venice, this maritime commercial superpower. But tiny Florence, or Florence kind of as it sees itself as tiny Florence, even though it's surrounded by greater cities, constantly wins. You know, it manages a degree of art and culture and commercial success that you wouldn't expect based on its size and its position. But it's got a kind of like a little man complex. Think of the way that like Philadelphia Eagle fans look at themselves. You know, Philly fans tend to have like an inferiority complex because we've got Washington to the south, we've got New York City to the north, and you know, everybody forgets us. We're the drive-through city. So they adopt David as their symbol. So when you're going through Florence, you'll see a number of artistic representations of David. And how do we know that this isn't a Greek or a Roman sculpture? Well, there's an anachronistic clue. So the thing that I like best about Donatello's David is the hat. So this is a hat that we would have seen in 15th century Florence, not 5th century BC Athens or 3rd century AD Rome. So we know for a fact that this is a more modern sculpture and not a classical sculpture. So there's Donatello's David. If we're still talking about painting and pre-High Renaissance art, I should also mention Botticelli's Birth of Venus. This too is in the Uffizi. One of the interesting things about this painting, and that we get from Botticelli, that we didn't see in the work of Cimabue or Giotto, and will really be heightened when we get to the Baroque period, is movement. Can you tell that there is movement in this painting? Looking from the left side of the painting to the right side of the painting, we can see that the zephyrs are blowing Venus, who is perched kind of elegantly on that clamshell, towards the land, where then she is going to be draped or covered up. And we can see the wind blowing through her hair, and we can imagine the wind blowing through that covering that's held by the woman on the shore. The flowers and petals are being strewn here and there. So yeah, there's a classical reference here because Venus was a Roman god or goddess, but the movement is what's really interesting here as well. So we're depicting movement as well as volume and depth in a Renaissance era painting. Now we get to the High Renaissance. So when we speak about the High Renaissance, it's this period at the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th century when the greatest artists of the Renaissance are all kind of working within a 25 or 30 year period. This is the age of Michelangelo. This is the age of Leonardo da Vinci. This is the age of Raphael. So let's start with Leonardo da Vinci. He was from the town of Vinci. See how easy this is? And the first painting I want to point out is his Madonna of the Rocks. And there's some things here that Da Vinci is adding to Renaissance art that are going to be carried forward and adopted by his successors. One is the naturalism of the background. So typically when painters of the Middle Ages or the Renaissance would depict figures, everything in the background was kind of an afterthought. But here, the rocks, the naturalistic background, the leaves, the foliage, almost take center stage, don't they? They're as important to the composition of the work as the figures themselves. And Da Vinci, who was, in addition to being a great painter, a great scientist, just a polymath. I mean, a guy who could. Well, you know all the stories about Leonardo da Vinci. I mean, he could write left-handed and right-handed at the same time. He came up with all these interesting sketches for inventions that we're still using in the 20th and 21st century. Things like tanks and airplanes and parachutes. Just a remarkable figure. One of the most intelligent people who have ever lived. And for that reason, because he was interested in so many different pursuits, we don't have very many paintings or frescoes by Da Vinci, but the ones that we have are really amazing. The most expensive painting ever sold was just sold by Christie's to a gentleman in Saudi Arabia. A friend of mine who works at Christie's helped broker the sale, and it was a Da Vinci painting. So If we take a look at the faces of the Holy Family, so this painting depicts the most popular figure in Renaissance art, and that's Mary, with the Holy Family. So that's John the Baptist as a child, uh, that she's cradling with her right arm, and then she has her left hand extended over Jesus, and you see the angel is kind of looking on there. So I will point out the illumination on their faces. So there's like a light source here in this painting. So you can imagine there's a sun somewhere, and the sun is casting light not only on the and creating shadows through that light, not only through the natural rock formations above, but also on their faces, and it's illuminating their faces, giving some depth to the composition. So we have the chiaroscuro effect if we look underneath their chins, and some non-distinct light source somewhere that's illuminating them. Also, take a look at the angel's wings. For this painting, Leonardo did some studies of birds' wings. And so rather than just having, feathers kind of sprouting from the back of the angel, like you would expect from an early Renaissance work or a work from the Middle Ages, the angel is depicted with realistic birds' wings, which gives it an added aspect of realism or reality. Madonna of the Rocks. This is Da Vinci's second most important work, The Last Supper. You've no doubt seen this before. If you want to see it in person, it is a fresco. And you'll recall that we said fresco was an artistic technique where paint is applied directly to plaster or directly to wet plaster, a technique called buon fresco. So you can't move it. Wherever you do the fresco, that's where it's going to be forever, unless you physically take down the wall and move the wall, which is not recommended for something that's 500 years old. But this is Da Vinci's Last Supper. When I used to show this the first time I started showing this painting to undergrads and to high school students, Dan Brown was very popular as an author. So this is where they started throwing conspiracy theories at me. So if we were having this conversation, I would say, in person, I would say this is a Dan Brown free zone. So please don't ask me about the Holy Grail and Knights Templar and the Illuminati. I don't really know much about it, first of all, and I don't get super excited about conspiracy theories. So there's so much that's actually interesting in this painting. We don't need to throw conspiracy theories at it. So if you were to go and see this painting live, it's in St. Mary's Church in Milan. And it is the most important thing, I think, in Milan to see. So what's interesting about this painting? Okay. One, we see Leonardo da Vinci, the mathematician, at work. So there is science, there is math at work here, there is geometry. The central figure, of course, is Christ at the Last Supper. Biblically, this is the night before Jesus is arrested and then eventually crucified. He's letting his followers, his apostles and disciples, know that he is going to be betrayed, and then he is going to be executed. So it's a moment of great tension for them. This moment, the Last Supper, is recreated when Christians go to church. So if you've ever been to a Catholic mass or an Episcopal mass, and you've seen the priest give out or the reverend give out pieces of bread, or they drink wine, this is the moment that's being recreated in that ceremony. But our eyes are naturally drawn towards the central figure, towards Christ. And Da Vinci does that mathematically. So let's take a look at the tapestries on the wall behind Da Vinci. We can imagine that this room that the walls in this room are naturally parallel to each other. It's a rectangular room. But if we look at the tapestries on the extreme right and extreme left are larger. and it's almost like there are two converging lines. Kind of like if you were to stand on train tracks. I don't recommend standing on train tracks, but if you were standing on train tracks, the tracks that you're standing on are going to appear larger, and then there's a vanishing point somewhere, down the tracks. It will appear, even though the train tracks are always going to be parallel to each other and equidistant from each other, at some point it's going to appear in the distance that they come together or converge. And that's what he's doing with the tapestries. So there are vanishing points. And if you look at the ceiling, it's the same thing. You see how the lines appear like they're going to come together somewhere in the distance. And if you follow those natural vanishing points, our eyes subconsciously are drawn to the center or focal point of the painting, which is Jesus's eye. So no matter where you start looking at this painting, you start looking anywhere in the painting that you want, your eyes are going to be drawn to the central figure, Christ, in his moment of serenity. Same thing with the eyes of the apostles here, his male followers. If you look at any of these figures, they're going to, because of where they're looking, the majority of them, they're going to draw us into Christ. Do you see how Da Vinci uses a number of different geometric forms here? Not just the rhombus, but also the triangle. So do you see how Jesus forms kind of an isosceles triangle? Start at the top of Jesus's head and then look at where his hands are positioned. It forms kind of a triangle. And then immediately to Jesus's left and to his right, there are triangles formed in the negative space. So everything brings us together, and all of the apostles are together in groups of three. And we can almost imagine triangles being formed out of all three of them, in the groups of three. Remember in previous works of art, like the Byzantine work of art that I showed you, the icon that I showed you, or the stained glass that I showed you, the sainted figures are depicted with a halo. That's how we know that they're holy. That's how we know that they're saints. There's like something glowing, like a glowing circle that the artist will draw behind their heads. But Da Vinci wanted this to look realistic. So I'll ask you, does Jesus have a halo? Look again. Yeah, the transom above the door in the background, which looks like it's just there as part of the room, functions as a de facto halo for Jesus. Isn't that interesting? So this is Da Vinci's Last Supper. This is, well, am I exaggerating if I say it's the most important painting in all of Western civilization? Da Vinci's Mona Lisa in 1505. The Italians call it La Gioconda, after the patron. So an important patron named Gioconda asked Da Vinci to paint this painting of his wife, Lisa. And we're 99% sure that's who it depicts. The Italians call it that for two reasons. One, it's the name of the patron. Two, it's kind of a pun, because the name Gioconda sounds like the Italian word for jocund or happy. And we see the most important thing about the face of the Mona Lisa, which is that wry smile, that almost indescribable smile. If you get a chance to go to the Louvre, you will see this painting. It is the most important work of art among many important works of art that are on display at the Louvre. But why is it so important? What is it about this painting that makes it the most important painting in all of Western civilization? The Mona Lisa is so famous and it's so important that if you close your eyes and say, think of a painting, this is probably the one that pops into your head. If you ask kids to name one painting, one famous painting, this is probably the one that they'll name. So what's going on here? Why is it so important? What do we know about the Mona Lisa? Well, if I asked you to write down a number of facts about the Mona Lisa, Probably near the top is the thing about the eyebrows. Let's not get fixated on the eyebrows, please. We're not sure why she doesn't have eyebrows. There's a school of thought among art historians that says that when Da Vinci painted this painting, he did give the Mona Lisa eyebrows, and subsequent cleanings of the painting and restorations of the painting, the eyebrows came off. That would be tragic. But there's so many interesting things going on here in this 1505 painting. We can point out a couple of the artistic conventions that I've already mentioned. I mean, if we look under her chin, we have the illusion of depth, and that's chiaroscuro. If you were still having a hard time kind of conceptualizing the idea of that smokiness or smofuto, where the artist is blending color to give the illusion of depth and three dimension, just take a look around the Mona Lisa's eyes. You know, that smoky look that women pay their estheticians hundreds of dollars for. That's what Da Vinci gave the Mona Lisa. Another thing that people bring up about the Mona Lisa, which is true, is the way that he depicts the eyes. The eyes will, with a lot of paintings, your eyes follow the painting. Mona Lisa is a painting where, depending on where you stand around the room, her eyes are following you, which is, I guess, at the same time unsettling, but also really cool. The smile is just indescribable. We're not really sure what she's smiling about. Da Vinci, like Titian, used to have, because the models would be sitting for so long, would have musicians come in and play for their models. So maybe she's smiling about the music. We don't know. The hands are important. The hands are a symbol of beauty here, and he spends a great deal of time with the hands. My favorite thing about the Mona Lisa, what I think is most interesting about this painting, is the background. Remember, Da Vinci takes great pain. If we recall the Madonna of the Rocks, he's someone that's very interested in that natural landscape. What I'd like you to do is imagine this painting without the Mona Lisa in it. Just focus on the background of the painting. Do you see how Da Vinci is kind of tricking us? This is a little game that he's playing with us. There is no way to reconcile the left side of the landscape with the right side of the landscape. They are two completely opposite pictures. But because we're focused on the figure of Mona Lisa, it's something that most people miss when they look at the painting. So interesting. I usually ask my high school students, is the Mona Lisa beautiful? And because we live in this like weird youth obsessed culture, the answer that I typically get is no. Mona Lisa is an older lady, but there is definitely a beauty there. And that's the important thing about Renaissance art, I think. The individual idea, or the humanist idea, that man and woman can be beautiful. That this thing that God has created isn't something that is, ugly and sinful, and is a vessel for sin. That man and man's accomplishments are valuable and are filled with grace and dignity. The Greeks and the Romans in their art sought to idealize or find the perfect the perfect examples of beauty. And here we have the Renaissance artist trying to capture that too. Can we measure beauty? I mean, is it possible now in the 21st century to write a computer algorithm and have that computer have artificial intelligence look at paintings or sculptures and say, this is beautiful or this is not beautiful? Let me suggest that we could. There's something that the Greeks understood about beauty that we know is a mathematical constant, and it has to do with symmetry. So if you were to ask people to rate just random pictures, Is this person attractive? Is this person not attractive? One of the things that they're going to measure attractiveness through is the idea of symmetry. Does the left side of your face equal the right side of your face? And the more symmetrical you are, the more attractive you are judged. And the Greeks understood this. This is why they made their buildings so symmetrical. However, nobody is completely symmetrical. And if you're not sure what I mean, find a picture of yourself looking straight forward, and then hold a mirror up, bifurcating your face from from the top of your skull down to your chin, and just kind of like look at the mirror left and right. You notice that you have two completely different pictures of yourself. So Leonardo's mission here, what he gives us is a Mona Lisa that is beautiful because she is symmetrical, but she's not 100% symmetrical. There are subtle differences between the left side of her face and the right side of her face, which means she looks to us realistic. I really like the Mona Lisa. But as I said in the Q&A portion, the Mona Lisa it's because it's so famous. It's basically famous for being famous. So it's the one room in the Louvre that you really, I mean, people line up in queues to go in and see it. And if you're there on a particularly busy day, you won't get within 30 feet of the Mona Lisa unless you're willing to throw elbows. Let's go back to a Cimabue painting. Remember how difficult it is to depict Mary in art. So here we have this weird Renaissance paradox. Mary is the most important figure in Renaissance painting, and Jesus, along with Mary, is the most important figure in Renaissance painting. But they are the two figures who are most difficult to depict because of the permutations through which Mary goes. Jesus, it's so hard to depict him because you want to paint a baby because there he is as a baby, but he's also, the savior of humanity. So how do we depict him with that measure of wisdom? How do we show Mary as a little girl, but also wise? Or how do we show her as an older lady, but also this saintly figure? And it's been very difficult for those depictions. The artists that come close achieve a measure of fame. No one did it better than our next artist. So not too long after Da Vinci is painting, we get Michelangelo. Michelangelo Buonarroti is maybe the most important painter in Renaissance history and is the most important sculptor in Renaissance history. This is my favorite sculpture of all time. It's the Pieta. It depicts Mary holding the dead body of Christ after he's been taken down from the cross after the crucifixion. Michelangelo did this sculpture when he was 24. And once he did it, he becomes world famous. It is the only sculpture, it's the only piece of work that Michelangelo ever did throughout his career that he ever signed. If you go to see it today, you're going to St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. You're going to the main church in the Vatican. By the way, Michelangelo also designed the dome for that structure. So his stamp is all over Vatican City in Rome. He carved it out of a single piece of Carrara marble. And it's simply beautiful. If you go today, it's behind a sheet of bulletproof glass. Some crazy person in 1972 attacked it with a hammer and smashed parts of Mary's face and knocked her arm off. It took a decade to restore it. Really, really unfortunate. But the only reason we know that it was signed is because when they reattached the hand of Mary, they saw he had carved his signature there. So what is it about the Pieta that makes it so remarkable? One is the texture. You see the carved out of a single piece of marble, and it looks like Mary's gown. I mean, it looks like a piece of fabric that you could pick up and wrap around the two figures. When you look at Jesus's body, when you see, you can see it. The skin almost appears to be translucent. It's like you can see the ribs underneath the skin. But what Michelangelo figures out here is so important. I mean, think about the Renaissance world. Even though this is a time of great learning and a time of great scholarship and a time of great discovery and skepticism and classicism, most people still couldn't read or write. So when they went to church to have a religious experience, it was the art through which they interacted. Michelangelo figures out how to get this moment right. So for those of you who are familiar with the story, Jesus is crucified around the age of 33. And if we imagine that Mary had Jesus when she was in her late teens, or maybe even her early 20s, that would make Mary in her late 40s or early 50s in this moment. Clearly, Michelangelo does not depict Mary as a woman in her 40s or 50s. This is Mary from the time of the Annunciation. This is Mary's face is that of the girl who was told by the angel Gabriel that she was going to give birth to the Son of God. The word pieta has the same root as both pity and piety. So you can imagine looking at this sculpture that you see the face of a scared little girl who's just been informed that her son is the Redeemer of all man, and all of those crazy emotions that must be going through the head of a teenager or a young woman who knows that her life is destined to end, or her son's life is destined to end in this moment. And there's just such complex emotions here and sadness that Michelangelo is able to depict in the face of Mary. The other thing here is Michelangelo plays around with the realism a little bit. Jesus's body is perfectly proportioned in the same way that Da Vinci would have insisted that the human body is perfectly proportioned. The leg bone in proportion to the femur in proportion to the bones of the arm, the length of the arm as opposed to the length of the legs and the torso and the head, and the way the body is lying is you could take Jesus out and use it as an anatomical study in a biology class. But look at Mary. Mary is the one that he plays around with. Mary's head is too small for Mary's body. And why does he do that? In order to cradle the body of Christ in a way that it's like she's wrapping him up. It's like imagine a mother cradling her infant. So he gives her that size in order to convey that emotion. Here was a child that I cradled as a baby, and now after he's been executed, I'm cradling his body once again. Just remarkable. So by distorting reality a little bit, Michelangelo gives us this religious experience. I'm not very religious myself, but I do get once you start talking about it, it's just and if you think about the meaning behind it, it's and then imagine if you were a Renaissance person who couldn't read or write, and you yourself were intentionally religious, like what seeing this would mean for you. So Pieta. And is it important in Western art? It sure is. Maybe you haven't seen this work before, but if you are familiar with the French Revolution, this is the most important painting of the French Revolution. This is by Jacques-Louis David. The painting is called Amarat. This is the death of Marat. Marat was the leading propagandist of the radical Jacobin faction of the French Revolution, and he's stabbed to death in his bathtub, and he becomes one of the martyrs of the French Revolution. So one of the things that the French Revolution tried to accomplish was to remove religion and remove Christianity from life, from public life. And what David is giving us here is a secular martyr for the French Revolution, but he is using a very recognizable religious symbology. And if I just flip through the picture, you can see Pieta here, Pieta here. Okay, so that is Pieta. His most recognizable statue, if you were to, just like if I were to say, close your eyes and think of one painting, and you would probably give me the Mona Lisa, or most students would give me the Mona Lisa. If I said, close your eyes and think of one sculpture, it's Michelangelo's David. David, as I said, with Donatello, becomes the symbol of Florence. So if you want to see the David today, you have to go to Florence. Unfortunately, it's not in the Uffizi, so you have to go to the Galleria Accademia, which is located right by the Uffizi. So if you really want to hit all of the important works of art in Florence, you're going to need a couple of days to do it. But the David is remarkable. At this point, Michelangelo is in his late 20s, and he's already world famous because of the Pieta. There was a single block of marble. Now, the marble itself was famous for being this giant hunk of marble, and no artist wanted to touch it, because if you screw it up, you've destroyed now this great block of this great hunk of marble. They called it the Beast. Michelangelo, in addition to being a superior artist in so many different ways, was also really full of himself, and he's going to give it a shot. The famous historian of the Renaissance and Western civilization, Lord Clark, depicted this moment, and he calls it the artist as hero. This is where we have artists as rock stars and not as simple technicians. And what Michelangelo has given us here is an homage to classicism, in that, yes, David is a religious figure. He's a figure from the Torah. He is a figure from the Bible. But this is man as the ancient Greeks would have depicted him. A face that is sure of himself. A David who is facing down Goliath and has such supreme confidence in his own abilities that there is nothing that he can't accomplish and nothing that he can't do. My favorite part about the David is kind of like what Michelangelo did with Pieta. So remember how there was kind of a distortion with Mary's head relative to her body. There is something that Michelangelo has distorted here that immediately draws our attention to. And maybe you can figure it out. Anybody get it? Yeah. So when you look at these hands and then contemplate that Michelangelo carved it out of a single block of granite, it's just remarkable. The veins on the hands, the fingers, the fingernails, there's such detail here that it almost defies belief. So there's Michelangelo, there's his David. If you get a chance to go to Florence, it's definitely on the must-see list. So the guy who's given us the Pieta and also gave us the David is responsible for the painting of the Sistine Chapel, the ceiling and wall of the Sistine Chapel. So the Sistine Chapel is part of the Vatican City complex. It is so named because it was built by Pope Sextus not because it was the 16th chapel in Vatican City. It's a great American question. Sometimes, we walk in and when we're taking the tour, famous tour question, where are the other 15 chapels? So this is the Sistine Chapel. It was in use. It dates from the Middle Ages. So this is a renovation project that the Pope asked Michelangelo to undertake. And Michelangelo was world famous as a sculptor. He was not a painter, and he was a little reluctant to do it. But I think let me speak on behalf of Western. I have no right to speak on behalf of Western civilization, but let me speak on behalf of Western civilization when I say thank you, Michelangelo, for doing it. This room is important to the Roman Catholic Church. When the Church picks a new pope, when the Pope dies or when the Pope retires, and there is an assembly of what we call the College of Cardinals. This is the room where they will meet and they will vote on a new pope. This is where if a new pope is picked or not picked, there's a chimney, and they will let the assembled crowd outside know that there is a new pope or not a new pope based on the color of the smoke that comes out of the chimney. There's also a room off to the side called the weeping room or the crying room, where when a new pope is elected, he takes a few moments and he goes into that room and is overcome by the emotion of being now the new pope. So the Pope asked Michelangelo to come in and paint the ceiling, and he agrees to do it. So between 1508 and 1512, the ceiling is being painted. Michelangelo did have assistants that helped him, but the design and most of the work is his. On the left is an older picture. I didn't take it. I took it from the internet. But over the last 20 years, there's been a restoration project that was recently completed to remove years of smoke and incense from the frescoes. So it was painstaking. And when people saw it for the first time, a lot of them were shocked and said, "You've destroyed the paintings," because Michelangelo never intended them to be that vibrant or that colorful. So that is a controversy surrounding the paintings. Personally, I like how they pop. I like how vibrant they are. So the ceiling depicts scenes from the Old Testament. Adam and Eve and Noah and the creation of man and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Very, very popular religious imagery. And Michelangelo had to work with the Pope and the cardinals and the director of the Vatican and negotiate kind of like what scenes were being painted. This may be the most famous panel from the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. It depicts, a fully formed, fully grown Adam being given the gift of life by God. So God is about to give him the spark of man. You can see how Michelangelo was obsessed here with hands, because the study of hands is with the contre-jour in the background is immediately the most important thing that your eyes get drawn to in this particular panel. The spark of life, the spark of man. When you take the tour of the Vatican, if you get someone to describe this panel to you, this is very controversial also. So Adam is depicted as laying in the Garden of Eden. God and the angels are in a cloud. The cloud is like a deep purple burgundy. And in the 20th century, there was an American psychologist who went and took a tour of the Sistine Chapel and looked up and said, "My God, that's the hemisphere of a brain." And so he used that interpretation to say that Michelangelo is giving us a very secular idea of man. I've always disagreed with that hypothesis. Yeah, I guess it kind of does look like a brain, but the use of the hemisphere model for the brain didn't come out till much later. for Michelangelo, much later than the 16th century. So, not to mention, Michelangelo was so intensely religious. I don't know that there's a hidden secular meaning here, but there may be. That is totally up to the way that you want to see it. But you will hear that interpretation if you take the tour of the Sistine Chapel. I like this painting better. So if you enter the Sistine Chapel, immediately you're going to look up and see the fresco on the ceiling. If you walk ahead a few dozen steps and then you make an about face, you turn around and look at the wall from whence you entered. This is a painting that Michelangelo did a few years later. This is called the Last Judgment, or the Judgment of Christ. It was super controversial in so many ways, but it's just so interesting. So typically when artists depict Jesus on or God at the moment of the Last Judgment, God and Jesus and Mary are depicted on. God is depicted as being on a throne. Jesus is on a throne, and the dead are resurrected, and he judges them, and they go to hell or they go to heaven. Well, here, Michelangelo has taken Jesus off of the throne. Do you see him in the center panel with Mary to his right? He's got his hand up in judgment, but the resurrected are kind of like circling him in the wind, almost like I've heard it described as, Jesus is the sun, and the planets are circling around him. Now, some art historians have taken that way too far and said this is Michelangelo depicting a heliocentric model of the solar system. Again, I think that may be too clever by half, but I just think it's so amazing that he's kind of taken them off the ground, and Jesus is at the center, and everyone else is kind of like swirling around him in this cool depiction of the Last Judgment. So around him are the saints. You see people who, in the upper left-hand corner of the painting, people going to heaven. In the lower right-hand corner, people who have been judged to be sinners, and they're going to hell. Here's a detail from the ceiling, the Sistine Chapel, the creation of Eve out of the rib of Adam. On the Last Judgment, Michelangelo depicted himself. So he painted himself, and he depicts himself as Saint Bartholomew. We know it's Saint Bartholomew because Saint Bartholomew is a Catholic martyr, Christian martyr, and he was flayed. So they cut his skin off. So there he is holding his own skin. Michelangelo always looked at himself as a tortured artist. Why can't people appreciate myself for my art? I'm sacrificing myself for my art. So he put himself into his own painting, which is pretty cool. This is so when you enter the Sistine Chapel, if as you're walking through the doorway, if you were immediately to look to your right, this is right by the door. These are the souls of the damned, and this is Minos the devil, but he gave him the face of the Cardinal Master of Ceremonies, Cardinal Biagio, and his face was unmistakable. He gives him donkey ears to depict that he's a fool, and Cardinal Biagio gave Michelangelo such a hard time about depicting nude figures that look at what he has the snake doing. Cardinal Biagio ran to the Pope when he saw this painting unveiled and said, look, I've been made ridiculous. Look at what Michelangelo has done to me. And the Pope just kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, look, Michelangelo put you into hell. I'm just the Pope. I have no purview over hell. That's between you and God and Michelangelo. So the painting stayed. But this is really the only reason we even know Cardinal Biagio today. So Michelangelo was brutal to his enemies. Third great artist from this period is Raphael. Raphael was another guy who lived and worked in Florence. Uh, but to see his most famous work, you would have to go also to the Vatican. This is another fresco in a series of frescoes, the most important of which is called the School of Athens. Raphael, you may know him better for his depiction of angels and cherubs. If you've seen these like delightful little pictures depicting, Cupid or Putis or cherubs, baby angels, uh, the best ones of those are Raphael or copies of Raphael. A lot of Raphael's work does not survive because Raphael was caught up in a really interesting interlude in Florentine history. You know, when the Florentines became more and more excessive with their art and their clothing and their sculpture, there was the pendulum kind of swung back in the other direction, and Florence had a religious revival, a very conservative religious revival led by a monk named Savonarola. And Savonarola said that all of their excesses and all of this art and all of this humanism was taking them down a path directly towards to hell. And in one of the most interesting but also tragic episodes in early Renaissance history, Florence had a a moment that we call the bonfire of the vanities, and people assembled their paintings and their jewelry and their stuff, and they burned it in a giant bonfire. And unfortunately, we lost a lot of Raphael's paintings to the bonfire of the vanities. Don't worry, they get Savonarola. Savonarola is eventually discredited and excommunicated by the church, and in a moment of supreme irony, he himself is burned at the stake in Florence, or killed and then burned at the stake. Uh, but this is my favorite work by Raphael, and if you get to the Vatican Museum, you can see it. It's the School of Athens, and this combines so many of the things that I like about the Renaissance and so many of what I've called the Renaissance values. So there is a religious aspect to this painting, but also you can see the revival of classicism. I mean, what architectural feature do we see repeated over and over again? It's the Roman arch. All the way in the background of the painting, it looks like a Roman triumphal arch. Think of think of the Arc de Triomphe at the Place de l'Etoile in the center of Paris, for example. It looks like a copy of that. But the arch is repeated over and over again. And the fact that we have arches stacked on top of arches, stacked on top of arches, gives us that linear perspective that we saw in Leonardo da Vinci's uh, Last Supper. So we have the illusion of depth here, even though it's on a two-dimensional surface painted in fresco. Um, there is a nod to classicism, not only in the architecture, but in the figures that is depicted. So the two central figures are Plato and Aristotle. Plato is pointing to the sky. He was more of a pie in the sky guy. This is how the world could be. For Plato's face as inspiration, Raphael paints the face of Leonardo da Vinci. And standing next to Plato is Aristotle. And Aristotle points at the earth. His hand is outstretched. He was more of a realist. This is how Earth is, and this is the best way that we can get along with each other with what we have. But surrounding Plato and Aristotle are figures from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, figures like Alexander the Great and Alcibiades and Euclid. Raphael, who was a great admirer of Michelangelo, also puts Michelangelo in the painting. So if you go to the very foreground of the picture, the guy resting his head on his hand, that is Heraclitus. And we know that it's a depiction of Michelangelo because the nose is broken. And Michelangelo famously had his nose broken by a fellow artist who punched him in the face. Um, but you get the idea that Michelangelo was a guy that a lot of people wanted to punch in the face. So there's Aristotle, and Aristotle is Leonardo da Vinci. I'm sorry, Aristotle and Plato. Plato is depicted as Leonardo da Vinci. They're holding books of philosophy. So classicism, individualism, but also if you were to imagine yourself over this imaginary three-dimensional building, it is also laid out in the style of a Greek church. So there is also a nod here to Christianity. So a little bit about Raphael's School of Athens and the High Renaissance. Next time we meet, we're going to take the Renaissance north, and we're going to see how Hieronymus Bosch and Albrecht Dürer and the and Erasmus of Rotterdam put their own little spin on what the Italians have started down here in Italy.